Everyone will look at Zankou and ask the same question. How much damage does she deal? But I think this is actually the wrong question to ask, because the more I look at her kit, the less Zankou seems like a traditional DPS. She seems to look more like a unit that changes the way an archetype works completely. She is not just applying damage over time, she is buffing it and spreading it. And if this works the way I think it will, Zankou might turn out to be a character you pull for more than just her damage. But because she makes every DOT character in the past, present and future better. There is, however, a catch, as that very same mechanic that could make her an incredibly future-proof unit might also be her very weakness, and that's what we're trying to figure out today. The easiest mistake we can make right now is looking at Zankou and looking at her ultimate and probably the huge numbers that will follow and conclude, okay, she is just another DPS. While I will admit, technically you would be right to say so, but mechanically, that description does not scratch the surface of what makes her special. Her kit appears to be built around three ideas: Scotch stacking, damage over time spreading, and follow-up attacks. These three effects surely do work together, but the most obvious ones that work together quite well is the Scotch stacking and the damage over time spreading. We will go over some theory over her follow-up attacks later on, but just looking at these two for now paints a very scary picture. Zankou's teammates aren't just there to buff her damage. They will need to feed this engine. That's an important thing to consider. A DPS usually says, give me buffs and I'll deal more damage. Zankou seems to say, give me teammates who apply more damage over time effects and I'll turn those effects into even more damage. And this is the first major difference between Zankou and a conventional DPS. A conventional DPS asks you to make them stronger. Zankou asks you to make the entire team's damage engine stronger, and then she becomes the character that operates that engine. So the real question isn't how much damage can Zankou do by herself, it's how much damage can Zankou extract from everyone around her. Now, Zankou isn't built around one permanent combat state. She's built around a loop. She moves between reality and illusion. In reality, she has access to a buff called the Hunt buff. She uses her basic attacks and her dodge counters to build up towards her transition. Her Sanguine Dash is the catalyst for her to move into the illusion state. The Sanguine Dash isn't just a skill you press and get stronger. The press provides a huge instance of break damage through disarray. It also applies Heart Wrench and also transitions Zankou. This for me gives an outlook on what I believe her intended rotation loop will look like. Her abilities present a loop for us. You build towards the transition, you enter the illusion, you exploit the damage over time effects with your basics that are now follow-up attack damage, you spread the damage over time effects, and eventually return to reality to do it again in the next cycle. When Zankou enters illusion, she loses the Hunt buff and gains delusion. Now, this is a buff that increases the critical damage of the damage over time that is currently on the target. So even her stance change isn't just for the sake of changing stances. Reality is about one form of offensive power with the Hunt buff, while illusion is about enhancing and spreading damage over time effects on the target. And then she eventually returns to reality through the Soul Cross. This triggers Oblivion and continues the larger cycle. This is why I believe we should look at Zankou more than just a traditional selfish DPS and more like a cycle-based damage over time driver. And suddenly the complicated kit starts looking much simpler. Reality builds the conditions and illusion exploits them. Zankou spreads the damage, then the cycle resets. That's the gameplay loop I think was supposed to be evaluating, not how big one ultimate screenshot looks, but how efficiently she can keep the machine running. Everything we've talked about so far sounds interesting, but there's one mechanic that could completely change how I evaluate Zankou. because applying another damage over time effect isn't necessarily revolutionary. Buffing another damage over time effect isn't necessarily revolutionary either. But what if you didn't have to apply those damage over time effects to every enemy yourself? What if one enemy already carrying those effects could effectively become the source of them for everyone around it? That's where Nightmare Waltz becomes so important. It sounds simple at first. It just spreads the damage over time effects. However, combined with the rest of her kit, the picture becomes somewhat scary. Zankou can apply her own damage over time effects, her teammates contribute their own, Scorch can accumulate as its own damage over time effect, increases the damage of DOT effects, and finally, Zankou can take all these effects and spread them to the enemies in the battlefield. The most important part in her team building quickly becomes who can give her stacks the fastest for Zankou to spread and buff. And that completely changes the team building question. We're no longer simply asking which characters deal the most damage. We're asking which characters can feed Zankou's engine the fastest, with the least amount of field time. And that brings us to what might be the most important part of this entire analysis. Who actually belongs besides her? This is actually where I believe discussing her potential teammates becomes quite interesting, as when we look at a unit like Sakiri, her grouping helps spread the mechanic that Zankou has. As the more units are brought together, the easier it is for the damage over time effects to spread. More importantly than the grouping, we have Sakiri's passive, as this increases the damage taken based on the number of unique DOT types affecting a unit that is currently under Scorch. So Zankou and Sakiri are not just simply buffing each other. Sakiri increases the value of having multiple type of DOT effects, while Zankou introduces a new DOT type and spread those DOT types to other units. This is what I mean when I say Zankou is an engine rather than simply another DPS. Sakiri isn't valuable here because she happens to be a strong character. She's valuable because her mechanics give Zankou more fuel to work with. But if that's the rule, there's an obvious problem. What happens when the character providing that fuel also wants to stay on the field? I know what many of you must be thinking. We already have damage dealers who excel at applying damage over time effects, and the minds of many will flow to Baikang and Lacrimosa. If you remember what I said earlier, the faster the stacking, the better it will be for the team and playstyle she is trying to establish. Now I won't run away from the fact that she might turn out to be a quick swap DPS. That is something we don't have much information on. Given, however, that she's currently tagged as a main DPS, it is safe to assume that she wants time on the field. This makes her team building a situation where you want teammates who don't spend a lot of time on the field. Basically, you can't have a team competing with her for field time. This is something we have to be careful of when building characters purely based on their character strength. Lacrimosa is one of the synergies I believe people are the most excited for. That and Daffoddill, of course, but we will get there. In theory, Lacrimosa has a team that perfectly abuses damage over time effects. Now, if you don't choose any monster skill with Lacrimosa's skill, that is an instant 5 stacks with just one press of a skill. And that is exactly the kind of teammate Zankou wants. Someone who can front load the damage over time effects and get out of the way, because Zankou doesn't necessarily need teammates who do nothing. She needs teammates who can do their job quickly. The elements of both units also react for the Scorch reaction. We can't deny the clear synergies being presented to us. Furthermore, the devs even use them together in a quick-sub-like team in the dev stream. The potential is there, and we all know how strong Lacrimosa already is, with A-rank units in her team. Baikang, on the other hand, is a questionable teammate, mainly due to the field time requirements. However, we cannot completely write off a potential combo where he uses his skills and swaps out. This will require more testing, but you can already see the idea. Hota has created a system where each character's DOT effect has become even more valuable, as it can be buffed and spread by Zankou. Remember what I said at the beginning about Zankou potentially being more valuable 6 months from now than she is on day 1. This is where that argument actually starts to make sense. Now, when we look further into the future, we think of a situation where hopefully this is very, very far in the future. A new DPS is released, and this unit objectively deals more damage than our Zankou. Usually, for a traditional DPS, this would be the end of the life as a usable unit, as the new damage over time unit would strictly have higher numbers. However, with the passive Zankou has, being able to drive the team's DOT effects, she might not find herself going straight to the bench, but joining the team as a driver. This is all future information we don't have and can't confirm. The main idea though that I'm trying to get across is that her benefit to the team is more than just damage. She also has utility, which makes her that much more useful as a teammate as opposed to standard damage dealers. Now we don't have to look that far into the future when we are thinking of potential synergies. The version 1.3 livestream has already introduced a character who seems to heavily interact with follow-up attacks. This is honestly where her base kit gets even stronger without even focusing on damage over time effects. As Zankou's attacks during illusion are classified as follow-up attacks, it is no coincidence that Lingko's kit interacts heavily with follow-up attacks and debuff-based scaling. As far as I can see it, Zankou has been presented with multiple avenues for synergies, follow-up attacks, DOTs, Scorch, and some potential quick swapping. She is one of the units who creates a high ceiling for team building. This actually makes me quite excited for potential teams and testing, more excited than I was for the Shinku team without Zero when I noticed Eroy has some off-field cycle generation. But there is a catch, and I don't want to gloss over it. A character whose value depends heavily on interactions can also become extremely dependent on the characters and said interaction. A case for this being Shinku with the charge reaction and the internal cooldowns. But as far as I can see it, the devs have tried to ensure that Zankou isn't locked to one playstyle. This all depends on her numbers and how the playstyles do in terms of damage, but she has another archetype we have barely spoken of. This is the alternate direction of Discord and Break. When you first think about it, it might be weird, as we first think Scorch and damage over time when we look at her kit, and potentially hexed with Lingko in the future. So why would you even consider these when we can clearly see what her kit specializes in? The answer is hopefully that Zankou will have significant value outside of pure DOT engine and hexed follow-up attacks. Her kit contains mechanics surrounding break and disarray, in particular her sanguine dash and the transition to illusion. This creates another avenue for building her, and this is actually a good thing. We all know that she would more than love to work in a team with Daffoddill in it. She will stop being purely a Scorch or a Hexed unit and become the character who happens to have an extremely strong relationship with Scorch and Hexed while also possessing other routes to damage. This will give her more flexibility, which is always a good thing to have. Now, I didn't want to go into this in much detail, but I would feel bad about not mentioning it. There is a potential downside to all of this. As the more complicated a team's engine is, the more chances that things can go wrong. Mechanically, just listening to her kit, she sounds like she has a high mechanical ceiling. This does not mean that it will translate to a difficult unit to play, however that risk is always there. pulling off everything she is meant to do could be incredibly satisfying. However, she might be a unit that is difficult to understand at first and get working to the best of her ability. We have seen misunderstood units getting doom-posted quite often. Hopefully, her overall rotation and power is not too difficult to obtain. Now for the question many are probably asking themselves. Should you actually pull for Zankou? Because understanding what she does is one thing, and understanding her team is another, but deciding whether she deserves your amulets deserves you to step back and look at your entire account. What if you already have a strong DPS? What if you don't have a key character she ends up wanting? What if you already have a team heavily invested? Perhaps the most important question is Zankou a character you pull because she is powerful today or because she has the kind of kit that could be more valuable tomorrow? My advice would honestly be to wait and watch. Unless you're a simp like me who can't let a katana-wielding white-haired lady pass you by, you lose nothing by waiting to see if the entire kit design philosophy she is trying to achieve actually works out and her strength is what I expect it to be. That's it for the kit analysis and overall discussion. I will see you during her launch to go over her teams and rotations as I always do. Until the next time, I will see you in Heather.